Hello and welcome back, dear students, to the second session of this audio series where I read out from the text Shalmala, which is prescribed for the first year students of BA, Karnataka University, Dharwad. As I've clarified earlier, this is not a class where I explain either an essay or a short story, but this is just an audio vlog or audio book where I read out the concerned unit. All right. This is because some of my students showed concern that they couldn't get hold of this text, Shalmala. I hope this will be helpful to you all. This is the second unit of the prescribed text Shalmala, the fortune teller. It is an interesting humorous story about a young couple who takes an old fortune teller to court and how the judge interacts with them, and we'll see what happens in the end. Okay, it's a very interesting one. Please pay attention. Everybody who knows anything about the subject will realize that this episode could not have happened in Czechoslovakia or in France or in Germany, for in all these countries, as you are aware, judges are bound to try offenders and to sentence them in accordance with the letter of the law and not in accordance with their shrewd common sense and the dictates of their consciousness. And the fact that in this story there is a judge who, in passing sentence, was guided not by the statute book but by sound common sense is due to the circumstance that the incident which I am about to relate could have happened nowhere else than in England. In fact, it happened in London, or to be more precise, in Kensington. No, wait a bit. It was in Brompton or Bayswater, or anyway, somewhere thereabouts. The judge was, as a matter of fact, a magistrate, and his name was Mr. Kelly J.P. Also, there was a lady, and her name was plain Myers, Mrs. Edith Myers. Unit 2. Well, I must tell you that this lady, who was otherwise a respectable person, came under the notice of Detective Inspector McCleary. "My dear," said McCleary to his wife one evening, "I can't get that Mrs. Myers out of my head. What I'd like to know is how the woman makes her living. Just fancy, here we are in the month of February, and she's sent her servant for asparagus. And I've discovered that she has between 12 and 20 visitors every day, and they vary from charwomen to duchesses. I know, darling, you will see she's probably a fortune teller. Very likely. But that can only be a blind for something else. Say the white slave traffic or espionage. Look here, I'd rather like to get to the bottom of it." "All right, Bob," said the excellent Mrs. McCleary. "You leave it to me." And so it came about that on the following day, Mrs. McCleary, of course without her wedding ring, but on the other hand very girlishly dressed with a scared look on her baby face, rang at Mrs. Myers' doors in Bayswater, or possibly Marylebone. She had to wait quite a while before Mrs. Myers received her. "Sit down, my dear," said the old lady, when she had very thoroughly inspected her shy visitor. "What can I do for you?" I, stammered Mrs. McCleary. It's my 20th birthday tomorrow. I'm awfully anxious to know about my fortune." "But, miss, what name, please?" quoth Mrs. Myers, and seized a pack of cards which she began to shuffle energetically. Unit 4. Jones, sighed Mrs. McCleary. My dear Miss Jones, continued Mrs. Myers, don't misunderstand me. I don't tell fortunes by cards, except, of course, just now and then, to oblige a friend, as every old woman does. Take the cards in your left hand and divide them into 5 heaps. That's right. Sometimes I read the cards as a pastime. But apart from that, dear me, she said, cutting the first heap. Diamonds! That means money. And the knave of hearts? That's a nice hand. Ah, said Mrs. McCleary. And what else? Knave of diamonds, proceeded Mrs. Myers, uncovering the second heap. 10 of spades, that's a journey. But here, she exclaimed, I see clubs. Clubs always mean worry. But there's a queen of hearts at the bottom. What does that mean? Asked Mrs. McCleary, opening her eyes as wide as she could. Diamonds again, mediated Mrs. Myers over the third heap. My dear, there's lots of money in store for you, but I can't tell yet whether you're going on a long journey or whether it's someone near and dear to you. I've got to go to Southampton to see my aunt, remarked Mrs. McCleary. That must be the long journey, said Mrs. Myers, cutting the fourth heap. Somebody's going to get in your way, some elderly man. I expect that's my uncle, exclaimed Mrs. McCleary. Well, here we have got something and no mistake, declared Mrs. Myers over the fifth heap. My dear Miss Jones, this is the nicest hand I've ever seen. There'll be a wedding before the year's out. A very, very rich young man is going to marry you. He must be a millionaire or a businessman because he travels a lot. But before you are united, you will have to overcome great obstacles. There's an elderly gentleman who will get in your way, but you must persevere. When you do get married, you will move a long way off, most likely across the ocean. My fees a guinea for the Christian mission to the poor Negroes. I'm so grateful to you, declared Mrs. McCleary, taking £1 and 1 shilling out of her handbag. Awfully grateful. Mrs. Myers, what would it cost without any of those worries? The cards cannot be bribed, said the old lady with dignity. What is your uncle? He's in the police, lied the young lady with an innocent face. You know, the Secret Service? Oh, said the old lady, and drew 3 cards out of the heap. That's very nasty, very nasty. Tell him, my dear, that he is threatened by a great danger. He ought to come and see me to find out more about it. There's lots of them from Scotland Yard. Come here and get me to read the cards for them, and they'll all tell me what they have on their minds. Yes, just you send him to me. You say he's on Secret Service work, huh, Mrs. Jones? Tell him I'll be expecting him. Goodbye, dear Miss Jones. Next, please. Unit 5. I don't like the look of this, said Mr. McCleary, scratching his neck reflectively. I don't like the look of this, Catty. That woman was too much interested in your late uncle. Besides that, her real name isn't Myers, but Meerhofer, and she hails from Lübeck. A damn German, growled Mr. McCleary. I wonder how we can stop her little game. I wouldn't mind betting 5 to 1 that she worms things out of people that are of no business of hers. I'll tell you what, I'll pass the word on to the bosses. And Mr. McCleary did, in good sooth, pass the word on to the bosses. Oddly enough, the bosses took a serious view of the matter, and so it came about that the worthy Mrs. Myers was summoned to appear before Mr. Kelly J.P. "Well, Mrs. Myers," the magistrate said to her, "what's all this I hear about this fortune telling of yours with cards?" "Good gracious, your worship," said the old lady, "I must do something for a living. At my age, I can't go on the music halls and dance." Said Mr. Kelly. "But the charge against you is that you don't read the cards properly. My dear good lady, that's as bad as if you were to give people slabs of clay when they ask for cakes of chocolate. In return for a fee of 1 guinea, people are entitled to a correct prophecy. Look here now. What's the good of trying to prophesy when you don't know how to?" "It isn't everyone who complains," urged the old lady in her defense. "You see, I foretell the things they like. The pleasure they get out of it is worth a few shillings, your worship. And sometimes I'm right. Mrs. Myers," said one lady to me, "nobody's ever read the cards for me as well as you have, and given me such good advice. She lives in St. John's Wood and is getting a divorce from her husband." "Look here," said the magistrate, cut her short. "We have got a witness against you, Mrs. McCleary. Tell the court what happened." "Mrs. Myers told me from the cards," began Mrs. McCleary glibly, "that before the year was out I'd be married, that my future husband would be a rich young man, and that I'd go with him across the ocean." "Why across the ocean particularly?" inquired the magistrate. "Because there was the 9 of spades in the second heap," Mrs. Myers said, that means journeys." "Rubbish," growled the magistrate. "The 9 of spade means hope. It's the jack of spade that means journey. And when it turns up with the 7 of diamonds, that means long journeys that are likely to lead to something worthwhile. Mrs. Myers, you can't bamboozle me. You prophesied to the witness here that before the year was out she'd marry a rich young man. But Mrs. McCleary has been married for the last 3 years to Detective Inspector McCleary. And a fine fellow he is too. Mrs. Myers, how do you explain that absurdity?" "My goodness me," said the old lady placidly. "That does happen now and then. When this young person called on me, she was all dressed up, but her left glove was torn. So that looked as if she wasn't too well off, but she wanted to make a good impression. Then she said she was 20, but now it turns out she's 25. 24, Mrs. McCleary burst forth. "That's all the same. Well, she wanted to get married. What I mean to say, she made out to me she wasn't married, so I arranged a set of cards for her that'd mean a wedding and a rich husband. I thought that'd meet the case better than anything else." "And what about the obstacles, the elderly gentleman and the journey across the ocean?" asked Mrs. McCleary. "That was to give you plenty for your money," said Mrs. Myers artlessly. "There's quite a lot has to be told for a guinea, huh? Unit 6. "Well, that's enough," said the magistrate. "Mrs. Myers, it's no use. The way you tell fortunes by cards is a fraud. Cards take some understanding. Of course, there are various ideas about it. But if my memory serves me, the 9 of spades never means journeys. You will pay a fine of £50, just the same as people who adulterate food or sell worthless goods. There's a suspicion too, Mrs. Myers, that you are engaged in espionage as well. But I don't expect you will admit that. As true as I'm standing here, exclaimed Mrs. Myers. But Mr. Kelly interrupted her. Well, we'll say no more about that. But as you are an alien without any proper means of subsistence, the authorities will make use of the powers vested in them and will have you deported. Goodbye, Mrs. Myers, and thank you, Mrs. McCleary. I must say that this inaccurate fortune telling is a disgraceful and unscrupulous business. Just bear that in mind, Mrs. Myers. What am I to do now? Sighed the old lady. Just when I was beginning to get a good connection together. Unit 7. About a year later, Mr. Kelly met Detective Inspector McCleary. Fine weather, said the magistrate amiably. By the way, how is Mrs. McCleary? Mr. McCleary looked very glum. Well, you know, Mr. Kelly, he said with a certain embarrassment. Mrs. McCleary, well, the fact is she's left me. You don't say so, said the magistrate in astonishment. Such a nice lady, young lady too. That's just it, growled Mr. McCleary. Some young whippersnapper went crazy about her before I knew what was happening. He's a millionaire or a businessman from Melbourne. I tried to stop her, but Mr. McCleary made a helpless gesture with his hand. A week ago, they sailed together for Australia. So with that, I come to the end of the second unit of the text Shalmala. I hope all of you all enjoyed the story. And if you like this audio vlog, then please do like and share it among your friends. Thank you.